I'm Veronica Marshall at the Capitol. This week on Senate Spotlight, May 19th, the last day of 2025's regular session has come and gone, but senators are still here, hard at work.
This is probably the hardest session I've ever been a part of, with so many unexpected twists and turns.
And it's not over yet. We have the details on what's extending the senators' stay at the Capitol and delaying the budget from being signed into law. And
we're leaving hundreds of millions of dollars on the table.
One strategy the Senate could utilize to help fund the state's healthcare system. And when severe weather hits, forecasters and emergency responders want the most accurate information, but some areas of the state are in a radar gap.
There were suddenly, tornado warnings for things that we could not see on the radar, but that somebody had confirmed on the ground.
The effort to improve public safety by closing the gap. That's all coming up.
Senate Spotlight is produced by the Minnesota Senate and Senate Media Services.
As of now, the 94th Legislature is officially adjourned until February 17th, 2026. During the break, senators typically return to their districts, but without a budget signed into law, they're still here at the Capitol. The reasons for that depend on who you ask.
Living together is really hard, and governing together might be even harder.
The last day of the Senate's 2025 legislative session started with a prayer for patience and perseverance.
Do not let these senators sink in the deep waters of frustration, disappointment, anger, uncertainty.
But frustration.
I've been waiting for the House to call a meeting of our Human Services Committee, and they seem to be disinclined to do that.
We're here to do the work of the people, and right now there is no work coming to us from the House.
And resignation.
It appears we're not going to get done on time.
We're still present on the Senate floor. And aside from the usual end-of-session chagrin,
there being 33 ayes and 33 nays, the A12 Gruenhagen Amendment is not adopted.
This is always a difficult time of the year. We have to make hard choices. Things that people really hope for aren't going to happen. They're letting that go. That comes with a lot of feelings and a lot of emotion.
There was another issue fueling some senators' discontent. Senate Majority Leader Aaron Murphy says compromises, concessions, and conditions that were set while the legislative leaders negotiated the state's budget targets are now being amended, and these changes are delaying the work. However, others say the addition of new ideas is just part of the process.
When you reach a conclusion in a negotiation and new conditions are being added that slow down the budget, that's frustrating, and that is getting in the way.
There's opportunities to move within that agreement and make sure that those bills come out in a way that we can have bipartisan compromise.
These compromises will be struck in the coming days as conference committees turn into working groups in preparation for the governor to officially call for a special session.
We've all represent different caucuses, and so trying to figure out how this puzzle fits together is a big chore.
The work of unsticking where we have people stuck is going to be the hard part of this next week, but that's what we have to do to get the budget put into place.
And so, while the regular session didn't end with a finished budget,
the Senate is now adjourned.
It did end with some hope.
I hope everybody's thoughts of the cabin and the lake will propel us to get done by Memorial Day weekend.
A budget must be signed into law before July 1st, the start of the next fiscal biennium. Otherwise, the government will run out of funds and shut down. This session, senators worked within tight budget targets to fund the state's programs and priorities. For some, that meant making compromises or trade-offs. For others, it meant looking for ways to prevent the misuse and waste of the tax dollars the state does have. Republican Senator Jordan Rasmusson focused on both this session, and he joins me now. Senator, thank you for being here.
Great to be with you.
Now, Senator, earlier this year, you had a hearing on the program integrity and fraud prevention within the Minnesota Department of Human Services, or DHS. What did you find?
It was the first opportunity that I had as a co-chair of the Senate Human Services Committee, and I had been hearing a lot of concerns from Minnesotans about waste, fraud, and abuse. And unfortunately, Minnesota has a fraud problem. And so we brought in the Office of the Legislative Auditor and the Department of Human Services to talk about human services fraud. And one of the big takeaways that we had from that hearing is that there oftentimes are enough rules and regulations, but the agencies aren't always following those rules and regulations. And that was one of the key takeaways that we heard from the legislative auditor, is that there can be recommendations that the legislative auditor puts forward, but sometimes the agencies aren't actually adopting those recommendations.
And that sounds probably exactly why you introduced Senate File 263, which requires the OLA, or the Office of the Legislative Auditor, to report to the legislature annually on whether an audited entity has implemented its recommendations. So where does that bill, Senate File 263, stand now?
So it's a part of the end of session negotiations, working with Representative Jim Nash in the House on that bill. So we'll continue to advocate for it. And I think there's a lot of respect for the Office of the Legislative Auditor, but we're not going to be fully utilizing their great work unless agencies actually implement the recommendations that they have. I was grateful that on the Senate Human Services bill, we did get a provision in there that would require the Department of Human Services to report back on their implementation status for any recommendations they get from the OLA.
It makes sense. If you're going to go through the trouble and the work of creating these, ideas, check and see if they've been implemented and find out why or why not. Absolutely. It sounds like, we might be picking on DHS a little bit, but OLA identified other departments of having areas for improvement. What were those departments?
One that was highlighted during our Human Services hearing was the Minnesota Board on Aging. And they do some really important work, including helping get meals to seniors. But unfortunately, they were missing out on a bunch of site visits and weren't able to verify that many seniors were actually getting the meals that the agency was getting billed for. And so we had the opportunity to talk about those issues, and we also had the Board on Aging come and address what they're doing to address the challenges that the OLA found for them.
That sounds great. If your caucus's ideas on how to counter fraud, waste, and abuse were adopted, how much money would you anticipate that could save the state?
It's tough to know exactly how much waste, fraud, and abuse would be prevented. I will say early on in session, Senate Republicans identified more than $600 million in what we called wasteful spending. And we've seen actually some of these policies get adopted. For example, the nearly $200 million that was set aside to look at creating a passenger rail between the Twin Cities and Duluth. It looks like Democrats are realizing that project's not going to go forward, and we're able to realize those savings and put it towards other needs that Minnesotans have.
That's great to hear that, you guys are working together and they're responding to some of the things you're bringing up. Something else that you've brought up is that when it comes to saving the state money and balancing the budget, Minnesota's program that offers health care to undocumented residents. Now, some of the program's supporters, like the Minnesota Hospital Association, say that in the long run, the program gives us financial benefits because it keeps people out of the emergency room and it limits severe cases. So how do you respond to comments like that?
I think, unfortunately, this taxpayer-funded healthcare for illegal immigrants is a really inefficient way to help our healthcare system here in Minnesota, because that program isn't eligible for a federal match. Versus if we were to take that funding and redirect it to help out Minnesota nursing homes, disability services, bring up Medicaid rates for rural hospitals, we get a dollar-for-dollar match. And so we're leaving hundreds of millions of dollars on the table that we could use to help our healthcare system and disability service system here in Minnesota. I think one of the other big concerns that I have is the explosion in enrollment that we've seen in this program. The Department of Human Services estimated about 5,800 enrollees in the first year, and we're just a little over 3 months into the program, and there's more than 20,000 illegal immigrant enrollees. So one of the concerns that I have is that given the $6 billion deficit we have, this program could make that problem even worse.
Speaking of cuts and funding, the funding for the MinnesotaCare program hasn't seen any cuts, while other programs that benefit from state funding, like disability services or nursing homes, are seeing cuts. So talk to me about how those cuts, what do they look like in your community and others like it?
Budgets are about trade-offs and priorities, and we've seen Senate Democrats and Governor Walz have about $1 billion in cuts to nursing homes and to disability services. And what I'm hearing from the area that I represent is that this could mean the closure of rural facilities. It could mean for families who have a loved one with disabilities that services aren't available in their area. And so that's a been a big priority for Senate Republicans, is looking at how we can soften the blow of the $6 billion deficit that was created by 2 years of a spending spree.
Yeah, I know you've mentioned in other interviews that it could require people who've lived in your area for their whole life to travel an hour away or so to get the services that they need, like for the nursing homes.
That's right, and it can mean that they no longer are close to family, they're no longer close to the church that they've been a member of for decades. And so especially in rural areas, we feel that when these nursing homes close or reduce services, because there isn't one just across the street, they might have to leave the community that they've lived in for their entire life.
A place where you found support across the aisle and across bodies is the state's housing shortage. And I want to read a quote of yours from an opinion piece you wrote with DFL Senator Lindsey Port and your colleagues in the House. You said, "Our state's history is one of collaboration, resilience, and finding common ground. By applying those values to the home shortage, we can build a Minnesota where everyone has the opportunity to thrive." Great words. Do you feel like now that we're towards the end of the session that the Housing and Homeless Prevention's omnibus bill lived up to those ideals that you wrote about?
Senator Port and I and our colleagues over in the House, we're still working on making sure that there's meaningful housing reform that gets passed this session. One initiative that did pass off the Senate floor, which I was happy to work on, is making sure that cities can't force families into a homeowners association. We're seeing more than 80% of new housing construction taking place within an HOA. And while that might be a good fit for some, it is driving up the cost of homeownership for many Minnesotans and putting homeownership out of reach for too many people.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. Is there any other piece of legislation or work that you've done this session that you're particularly proud of?
Part of the work here at the legislature is introducing bills and passing bills, but sometimes it means actually trying to slow down and stop some ideas that you think could be harmful for Minnesotans. And one of the issues that I'm really concerned about is the legalization of online gambling. And we've seen different proposals on online sports betting that want to put a casino on Minnesotans' phones. And we've just seen from other states that have legalized online gambling the detrimental impacts that it can have on families. For example, in states that have legalized online gambling, we see an increase in personal bankruptcies of about 25 to 30% within a few years. And so there's a bipartisan group of legislators here in the Minnesota Senate who have been really monitoring this issue and making sure that if this gets proposed, and we're going to seriously consider it, that we have to look at the harms that online gambling can cause to Minnesotans.
Yeah, it's such an interesting topic because it is pretty well split. There are people on both sides for and against. So it's just one of those topics where everyone has a stance. It's pretty neat. All right, Senator, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
The committee that's going to decide what gets cut and by how much is on the third floor. They're up there. So my question to you is, can you make them hear you?
Dozens of disability rights advocates and service and waiver recipients raised their voices at the Capitol this week in an effort to have their concerns heard. Rallygoers said the Human Services Budget Bill balances the state's budget at the expense of people with disabilities. As of now, the Human Services Finance Bill is still being reviewed in a working group, where senators and members of the House are working to reconcile the different versions of the bill. Tourism is a vital part of Minnesota's economy. According to Explore Minnesota's latest report, more than 80 million people visited the state in 2023, spending $14.1 billion and generating over 180,000 jobs. Our guest today says that to keep that part of the economy strong, we need to protect our environment and lakes from climate change. And he's introduced several bills this session to further that goal. Joining me now is the DFL senator who represents Senate District 4, Senator Rob Kupek. Senator, thank you for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure.
Now, Senator, you joined a new group this session, which was the Blue Dog Coalition, which aimed to elevate rural or greater Minnesota voices and issues. So what are those issues, and do you think the coalition was successful?
Yeah, I think, we have kind of informally been that coalition, and I think this year to kind of maybe formalize it a little bit more, set up regular meetings and have discussions. I think it's been really helpful. And we have a couple of members that are, closer to the Twin Cities too. So it's been kind of a nice mix. But I think, sometimes things play one way in the 7-county metro don't necessarily play the same way out into greater Minnesota. And so I think just having that lens to look at things through a greater Minnesota viewpoint, I think has been very helpful. And I think having more of us together kind of educates more of our colleagues on what we're thinking.
Something you've talked about often are climate concerns, and some of the legislation you've supported this session really seeks to further that. One being the push to further develop Minnesota's sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF industry. So what is SAF, and why should Minnesota get involved, or why are we a good spot for this?
Sure, we in some ways are the almost perfect spot for this. So sustainable aviation fuel, think of it as the jet equivalent of biodiesel, right? It's sustainable aviation fuel that has at least cuts carbon emissions by 50%. And this is kind of the toughest nut to crack within the transportation realm, is how do you cut emissions from airplanes? You know, you can do electric cars, batteries are heavy things. That's not exactly what you want on an airplane. Airplanes need to be light to fly. So sustainable aviation fuel, if we can cut those jet emissions by that much, that's a huge leap forward. And it's made with all the things that we make in Minnesota. So it's a new market for our farmers, and even our timber industry. Actually, wood waste products are a huge work really well to make sustainable aviation fuel. So that's one of the areas I think is the best. So the combination of us being a huge agricultural state plus having a huge airport in Minneapolis-St. Paul makes us the perfect spot to do this. And we've been a leader in sustainable aviation fuel, and I think, you know, we want to make sure we continue that.
And so that bill that you had for that, Senate File 1312, which was bipartisan, you called it a win-win for the aviation industry and our farmers. So what kind of response did the bill receive from those industries, and where does that bill stand now?
Yeah, a really good one. So, I mean, farmers, Farm Bureau, Farmers Union, all supportive of that. Delta has been a huge leader in this area too. That's really helped us here in Minnesota, the fact that we're a hub. And I did co-present it with Senator Jasinski. It's actually Senator Rest is the chief author, so it really is a good bill. So what that does is we've been the leader, but other states have looked and gone, hey, Minnesota's given this tax credit. We can match that tax credit. So what we want to do is extend out the life period of that tax credit. That sends the message to industry that, you know, we're really serious about this. Plus, we changed a little bit too. We made the tax credit a little bit more if you can make that carbon score go even higher than the 50%. And so that's also kind of an incentive towards industry to move in another direction. Plus, in my district, you know, they're looking at building one of these sustainable aviation fuel plants in Moorhead. It'd be great for the city. They're looking at possibly about 600 jobs that would come with that plant. Plus, all our farmers in the area, that's a new market for them to sell their crops to. So it is a win-win situation.
Love those. You also put forth a bill that would establish a license plate for our solar pollinator programs. Obviously, we know what pollinators are, but what is a solar pollinator program? And talk to me about how the license plate can help with those efforts.
Sure. So the idea of a solar pollinator, and this is also something like the University of Minnesota at Morris is working on, where for agricultural, like for livestock too. So with that at Morris, they take the solar panels and they raise them up a little bit higher. So then the cattle or sheep or goats can come in and graze around that and then use the solar panels as shade. Cows like to get out of the sun in the summer just like we do, look for a little bit of shade. So that also kind of a win-win situation. So you keep that in some kind of agricultural use, but then get the benefit of also having solar panels on it. So the same idea with the pollinators is that you, around the solar panels, put in flowers that are, that bees like to go to. You get honey production out of that, and that's when. So the pollinator program was set up several years ago, but never had kind of any dedicated funding to it. And I think when we're looking at a year where there's some tighter budgets, I think they thought, well, this is an interesting idea. We'll make the license plate. If people get that license plate, the funds from that go towards that program. So in a way, it's a way to self-fund that program and also spread the message on cars all over the state of solar pollinators.
Yeah, it's a nice way to get the message out and to support that program. So We know that you cover climate concerns, and weather events have become more severe over recent years. You want to help meteorologists forecast these events so they can warn their communities so people can be safe ahead of time. And so you pushed for additional radar to improve public safety. Talk to me about the need for this legislation, which has been called life-saving, and the bill's current status.
Yeah, so this one's a little bit, this is a tough one. So the bill, out in western Minnesota particularly, and there's other places in the northeast part of Minnesota too, but there's a weather radar by the National Weather Service between Fargo and Grand Forks in Mayville, and then the next ones are Duluth and Minneapolis. And so when that radar beam leaves the radar site, it travels in a straight line. Well, the Earth curves, and then that beam, as it gets further away from the radar site, becomes higher and higher and higher in elevation. And so when you get into places like Alexandria, Minnesota, up through Park Rapids to Bemidji, that radar beam from both Mayville and from the Twin Cities is so high, you will miss things at the ground. So I worked as a meteorologist for 20 years. I can think of lots of times in my career where there were suddenly tornado warnings for things that we could not see on the radar, but that somebody had confirmed on the ground. And so the bill I had basically would give money out for bids for companies to come in and fill in that gap from the private industry with radars. There's one company that's doing this. They've already put one up in Wendell, Minnesota. That's kind of prime spot right within that gap to do that. And really they would go out to bid, but what the companies are looking for is they want to make sure that there's some kind of return on investment. And they know that if the state is going to purchase that data, make it available to the public, that they would have that. Unfortunately, in a very tight budget year that comes through the judiciary, which is worried about making sure our correction officers, we have funding for our jails, our court system has the funding up and running. In a tighter budget, they did not have the extra funds to go forward. So great idea, will remain on the table. We'll bring it back in a different budget session or find a new way to fund it. But I still think some of that work will go forward, probably just not as fast as we'd like it to.
Well, forgive the pun, but you put it on the radar. So
right.
It's a place to start.
Well played.
Thank you. Right. So you also authored Senate File 1690 to make recycling electronics less expensive by shifting the cost from consumers to manufacturers, and it was said the program would be self-funding. So talk me through how that works.
Sure. Right now, if you, depending on where you are in Minnesota, it varies by county, but you say you have a television set and you show up at the recycling center and you do the right thing and you bring it and they say thank you, and then they hand you a bill, $25, maybe over $100 to recycle that. And then I think some people are like, that's interesting, and then maybe they take that back and it doesn't end up. It ends up somewhere either falling off the back of a truck in a ditch or into a dumpster somewhere. And then the counties, who are the responsible agents in most areas for picking up recycling, they still got to now recycle that TV. They didn't get the funding for it. And particularly in greater Minnesota, most of our electronic waste has to get shipped to the Twin Cities. So there's a trucking cost and a shipping cost that come along with that. So the idea behind this bill was to see how can we find more places so that people make it more convenient to recycle their electronics, and also get some more money back to our counties, particularly in greater Minnesota, which are losing money on electronics recycling, because these are not things we want in landfills. They're not things we want in our garbage incinerators, and there's valuable metals in there that we could use to make new electronic devices. And particularly when you're looking at we want to decarbonize our economy, we need all those precious metals that we can get out of that. So the idea, last year after we talked with some retailers, because we had this plan last year, but it would have put money right at the point of sale on consumers. They said more other states have put this back on manufacturers, kind of as like, you're producing this, you're making this waste, you have some responsibility for it. And so the idea was to shift that money back onto those producers to come up with that. Right now it is in the Environment Policy Omnibus Bill, still not sure whether that has a path forward. We're very focused on a budget, so policy is like a great thing, but right now we want to make sure that by July 1st we have a new budget in place so that the state remains open and functioning. So we will see, but might be another one of those like next year great idea thing in a policy year.
Yeah, fair enough. What would you say has been your greatest achievement this session?
You know, I think I have two bills that I'm really proud of. I had the first bill that made it through both the Senate and the House and signed by the governor, and it doesn't sound like a super exciting, sexy bill, but it was about grain buyers. And this was actually a bill that I had last year that got kind of knocked out in a conference committee, but there was a constituent, and basically these small grain buyers who don't do a lot of money, they have to go and get full CPA audits, sometimes costing tens of thousands of dollars when they are not doing a lot of money. So the grain buyers bill, what it did was said, okay, smaller grain buyers, we still want some check, but you can use a tax attorney, somebody like that, to look over your books. Larger grain buyers, yes, you still need to do the full CPA audit. And particularly, there was one person in my district who was a small grain buyer, and he was just like, I have an $18,000 CPA bill. I don't make enough money to cover an $18,000 CPA bill. So that was one of those things where it's like, this is a really good fix, and it actually, directly impacted one of my constituents. That was a good win. And then the other one is another bill that I worked bipartisanly on with Senator Dornick. Last year, we passed a bill around broadband. We've got lots of money coming in from the federal government, and we put some safety requirements in place of 40 hours of training. Well, the industry said, look, we don't know that we can meet all of that training and get the job done on time to make sure we get all the federal money we've got coming in. And we want that federal money, and we want to get broadband to as many people as we can in Minnesota. And so with Senator Dornick, the two of us met with labor and industry and kind of came to some agreements. We pushed the start date back for that effective date for when those requirements had to come. That was a big thing because we pushed it back into the winter. They're not being able to put things in the winter. They can focus on training then. That gives them this summer to roll ahead on that. And also did recognize that we do need that training, but did provide some, if you've had the training recently, some requirements. So it's not all 40 hours of maybe something that's repetitive, kind of fitting in some of those things that you've already learned, giving credit for those. And so kind of a win-win situation. I think it was really good to see labor and industry come to some kind of agreement. I think Senator Dornick and I just kind of were shepherds in that process. But and then we did pass that also along to the House as a standalone bill because there's a July 1st date. We want to make sure that we get that date moved back to January so that this summer, not only the construction can go on, but the people who have to enforce it know what the rules are going to be.
All right. Senator, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. This was a lot of fun.
Fantastic. Senators are now working outside of the regular session in preparation for a special session to pass the budget. So what is a special session? It permits legislative action when the legislature is not meeting. Only the governor can call the legislature into a special session, but the legislature determines the length and purpose of the session. That's all the time we have today. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time.